She declared war on me over my fence. Yeah, really, the HOA president swung into full-on siege mode like I'd stolen the Declaration of Independence, and for a while I thought I was the punchline in some suburban satire. You might laugh, but I'm telling you this straight. I moved out here to breathe, not to become the hero of a neighborhood soap opera. I'm Jack Miller. I spent my life in places that taught me how to be ready, first as a soldier, then doing work that made me good at noticing details nobody else cared about. When I finally walked away from all that, I wanted one thing: quiet. Not the kind you get with noise-canceling headphones, the kind that settles into your bones where the wind does the talking. And your biggest worry is whether the tomatoes will get enough sun. So I bought 5 acres on the edge of a pine grove, a little weathered cottage with paint that had given up 10 years earlier, a porch that slumped like an old man at the end of a long day, and I fell in love with it. The house wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I spent my days fixing boards, turning the yard into something green and stubborn, and at night I walked the property listening to leaves argue with each other. It was the kind of peace you can taste. And then there was Mapleview Estates, the shiny teeth of suburban sameness pressing up right against my fence. Picture perfect lawns, identical beige houses, signs that read, "Welcome home" in someone's favorite font. They looked like a brochure come to life, and they smelled faintly of power trips. At the center of that little kingdom was Karen Bradley, sharp hair, sharper smile, and a talent for turning rules into weapons. She ran the HOA the way someone runs a tight ship, except her ship had anchors made of petty fines and other people's fear. It started with a letter, formal, stamped polite in the way a snake might be polite. Community standards, it said, violation notice, and listed my fence, my unruly yard, my unauthorized structures. I laughed, tossed it on the counter like it was a mosquito I'd swatted. My deed was clear, my land sat outside their rules. But 2 letters became 3, then phone calls. When I finally picked up the line, Karen's voice was syrup-sweet and thin as glass. "Mapleview has updated its boundaries," she told me, precise as a headline. "You'll need to comply going forward." I told her gently at first that boundaries didn't shift because someone redrew a map and liked the look of it. She said they had legal documentation. She said it like that solved everything. I remember the way she paused between sentences, the little inhale she gave herself before doling out the next calm, tiny indignity. That pause told me a lot about the person I was dealing with. At first it was whispers. Karen would plant ideas. "Have you noticed traffic to that property? Strange people, odd hours, and people listened because gossip is cheap and scary." The looks started: joggers who slowed down to check me out, neighbors craning necks as they passed, mutters that lodged in the air like grit. Then came the petty stuff: trash tossed near my fence, a broken chair where my roses should have been. My cameras picked up shadowy figures moving like they were on someone else's mission. And then there were the drones. You don't notice the sound until it sits on top of everything else. Little mechanical bees buzzing my sky, angling toward the house, hanging above the vegetable beds. I replayed footage until the edges blurred, and each time the same logo would pop up on the drone's control feed: Mapleview Security. My stomach tightened, but I did the thing I've always done: I documented. Dates, times, a tidy file cabinet of evidence, because patience has its uses when you've been trained to wait for the right moment. Karen didn't stop at rumor. She took the whole thing to a meeting, standing in front of a room of neighbors, voice steady concern painted heavy across her face. "There's suspicious activity," she said, eyes scanning like she'd already picked the guilty party. "We have reports. For the safety of our children." She watched people fold into worry. That's how she worked fear as a tool. By the end of the night, she'd convinced enough folks to pump more patrols into the neighborhood. People call it community policing. I called it a theater of intimidation. The first real strike happened in the deep quiet of an early morning. I woke to the sound that makes you think you're dreaming wrong: screeching tires, metal against metal. My gate, the gate I'd put up with my own hands, came off like someone had decided my property was theirs. My monitors showed uniforms, flashlights, clipboards. They moved like a force that believed its own righteousness. Someone bashed the front door. The house filled with the staccato sound of boots and the clatter of drawers. They claimed an anonymous tip. They waved a paper that looked official and smelled of malice. It wasn't a warrant, it was a scrap of power. One guard laughed as he rifled through my desk. "Karen's gonna love this," he said, and something in me went ice cold. My camera had them on film, every rough-handed flip of a family photo, the crash of glass as a frame of my wife who wasn't there anymore and who we hadn't put in a museum met the floor. I called the police. I did what I'd always done when lines were crossed. I reported it. Police lights painted the yard red and blue, and for the first time in months, the chaos had edges. The officer watched the footage with his mouth set hard. Karen arrived breathless and controlled, wearing the look of someone who'd rehearsed every line. We were protecting the neighborhood, she said, soft like gravy. The officer looked at a camera angle that showed a guard jerking a gate free, and his expression moved from polite to plain. We weren't neighbors in disagreement anymore. We were people watching someone's theatrics unravel. The lead officer didn't care for theatrics. He read through the paper and the fabrications began to show like a cheap set under stage lights. No illegal substances, no warrant. The guards were detaining each other in a different kind of spotlight. Karen's mask flickered. When the cuffs went on, the world felt oddly slow. Her protests filled the yard silver and thin. I was protecting the children, she said, and I watched for a spark of remorse that never appeared. Instead, there was calculation. But that moment watching her escorted away felt like the first note of a song that had been stuck in my head for months finally resolving. What followed was messy and beautiful in the way truth sometimes is. Detectives dug into records and found a pattern that looked less like a fluke and more like a long con. Karen had been redrawing lines, manufacturing fines, forging maps, turning bylaws into a revenue stream and a control mechanism. Neighbors I thought had been mindless suddenly had stories: an old couple forced to sign away their yard, a woman who'd been billed thousands for holiday decorations that never existed. It painted a picture I had been too close to see until the law took a magnifying glass to it. Then came Evelyn Carter, a lawyer with a soft voice and teeth that didn't smile when she didn't mean to. I didn't expect an ally, not really. I figured I'd tell my story and shuffle back to my porch. Evelyn showed up with a stack of printouts and a kind of focus that made me relax the way you do when the right person walks into the room. She built the case like someone putting together a clock, precise, logical, relentless. We had the drone feeds, the footage of the gate, the forged maps, emails where Karen had instructed her team. The trial felt like a long, slow storm. On the stand, I told the jury about the nights I planted tomatoes and the mornings I tended them, about the sound of pine needles when the wind read a book to the trees. I didn't say it to be poetic. I said it so they'd see the life she tried to take from me. Evelyn unraveled Karen's story thread by thread, and when Karen took the stand, her performance that had once intimidated a room sounded small under oath, brittle even. The moment the judge announced the verdict, I felt a strange release. Guilty on counts that mattered: forgery, false reports, unlawful invasion. Justice isn't a tidy thing. It didn't bring my wife back or rewind the months of phone calls and suspicion. But it made a public statement: systems built by people can be gamed by people, and sometimes they will be, unless someone calls the play. The court ordered restitution and recommended an overhaul of the HOA's governance. That felt like a seatbelt thrown across the neighborhood's collective chest. Afterward, life folded back into a slower rhythm. There were apologies, some clumsy, some earnest. People who'd cheered Karen on came by with hands that trembled and offers to help kids with paintbrushes and grown-ups with tools. A block party materialized one warm evening out of nowhere, full of cheap lights and excellent potato salad, and I stood in the doorway watching neighbors relearn how to be neighbors. It was strange to be the guest of honor at my own little parade, but I allowed myself the small pleasure. Karen sits in a bland cell somewhere now, stripped of her clamps and her scripts. For a while, she blamed everyone but herself. Then the state of being alone, real unperformed isolation, worked its way under even her bravado. Nobody sent letters. Nobody came. I don't celebrate her loneliness. I note it. Power wielded like a hammer tends to turn inward when the hammer breaks. There's a lesson running through all of this, and I don't mean to sound like some sermon. It's simple. People will test boundaries if you let them get away with it. And small cruelties can become systems if someone keeps turning the crank. The thing I learned, the bitter small thing that lands in your chest and won't leave, is that defending what's yours sometimes means being louder than you want to be, and that quiet isn't always cowardice. That realization came after the trial in the quiet afternoons when I'd sit on my porch and let the wind narrate my life again. So here's where I leave it with you. When does protecting a neighborhood cross into controlling it? When does looking out for safety become looking down on people who don't fit a picture? I want to know what you think was. I right to fight this as hard as I did, or should I have taken a quieter path? Tell me your stories. Have you ever watched someone use rules to make power look like concern? Or worse, have you been the person who looked away? If you've got a moment, share it, whether it's a comment, a memory, or something you saw once while driving by. I'll listen. Because standing up for a small patch of land taught me a bigger truth: justice isn't automatic. Sometimes it shows up late, and sometimes it shows up because someone kept the receipts.